Hey guys, tonight we're diving into shockingly taboo jobs in 18th century Europe. From grave diggers to sewage workers, and no, it's not cute. It's weird, it's wild, and you probably wouldn't last 10 minutes without getting a bucket of human waste dumped on your head from a third-story window. You think your job is bad? At least your daily tasks don't involve a high risk of contracting cholera, being ostracized by society, and getting paid in coins that smell faintly of death and regret. You probably won't survive this historical career fair, especially since the welcome basket is just a raw turnip and a case of dysentery. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, because my internal clock is powered by chaos and caffeine, and I crave validation from strangers on the internet. Bonus points if you're watching this while pretending to work. We've all been there. Now grab snacks, mute your mom, and let's get weird together. You step out of your time machine and into what you assume is 18th century London. But your first clue isn't the horse-drawn carriages or the guys in poofy wigs. It's the smell. Oh, the smell. It's a physical presence. Punches you in the face, kicks you in the shins, and then steals your wallet. It's a complex, multi-layered perfume of coal smoke, unwashed humanity, rotting garbage, and a base note of industrial-grade sewage that has given up on life. Your 21st century nose, accustomed to scented candles and air fresheners, immediately files for divorce from the rest of your face. The street is a narrow, muddy canyon between leaning timber-framed houses that look like they're whispering gossip to each other across the alley. There's no sidewalk, just a treacherous swamp of mud, animal droppings, and discarded oyster shells that threatens to suck the shoes right off your feet. A symphony of chaos assaults your ears. The iron-rimmed wheels of a carriage rattling over cobblestones like a machine gun, the shriek of a pig that has just been run over, and the constant, overwhelming roar of thousands of people shouting, haggling, and coughing up their lungs. A man in a ridiculously powdered wig just sneezed directly into his hand and then used it to brace himself against the wall you're leaning on. Welcome to the Age of Enlightenment. It's lit, fam, mostly by burning coal and the occasional plague pit. Suddenly, you hear a cry from a window above, "Gardalo!" Before you can even process the word, a tidal wave of liquid splashes onto the street just inches in front of you. You've just narrowly avoided a direct hit from someone's chamber pot. This is the city's waste management system, and you are standing in the splash zone. It's a mainstream historical fact that in most 18th century towns, there was no centralized sewage system. People collected their household waste, all of it in buckets, and chucked it into the street. The French phrase "garde l'eau," watch out for the water, was the customary, often ignored warning shot. The roads were open sewers, and a good sense of timing was more valuable than an education. You press yourself against a wall to avoid being trampled by a sedan chair carried by two weary-looking servants. Inside, you catch a glimpse of a wealthy lady, her face a mask of white lead paint and her hair sculpted into a towering, powdered monstrosity. She smells, you imagine, not clean but expensive. This is a wonderfully quirky tidbit about 18th century hygiene. The rich didn't necessarily smell better, they just smelled different. Bathing was infrequent and often considered medically dubious. Instead, the wealthy would douse themselves in powerful perfumes and powders to mask the underlying funk of a body that hadn't seen soap and water in weeks. The resulting aroma was a bizarre cocktail of musk, flowers, and pure, unadulterated BO. It wasn't about being clean. It was about smelling rich enough to afford the cover-up. You're looking at the original influencer, and her signature scent is rose petals and desperation. As you stand there, ankle-deep in filth, dodging falling feces and smelling the human embodiment of a potpourri bowl in a gas station bathroom, you can't help but think of the philosophers of this era. Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, all these guys were sitting in their studies, writing brilliant treatises on reason, liberty, and human rights. And this is where historians still argue whether the Age of Enlightenment was really an era of progress for everyone, or just for a handful of dudes in wigs with access to a library and a functioning fireplace. Was it a great leap forward for the human intellect, or a period where the gap between the perfumed rich and the stinking poor grew into a chasm filled with literal garbage. The debate is hilarious when you realize that while they were debating the abstract nature of freedom, most people were trying to figure out how to cross the street without getting a face full of horse manure. This is the world you've landed in. It's a vibrant, innovative, and philosophically groundbreaking cesspit. And in a world this profoundly and creatively disgusting, someone has to do the dirty work. Someone has to go into the sewers that don't exist. Someone has to handle the bodies, the rats, the waste, and the grime that this glorious, enlightened society produces in terrifying quantities. These aren't the jobs you read about in history books. They are the taboo professions, the disgusting but essential careers that kept the whole stinking, powdered, brilliant machine from collapsing under the weight of its own filth. You take a deep breath and immediately regret it, as you prepare to meet the unsung, unwashed, and unbelievably underappreciated workforce of the 18th century. The sun has set on the age of enlightenment, and the city exhales a collective sigh of relief. The crushing daytime crowds have thinned, the workshops have gone quiet, and for a blissful moment, the noise level drops from jet engine to a mere industrial blender. You press yourself into a dark, reeking doorway, thinking you might finally get a moment's peace. You are wrong. So very, very wrong. As the moon rises, a new kind of activity begins. A cart, its wheels muffled with rags, creaks slowly down the street, pulled by a horse that looks like it lost a bet with God. Following it are two figures, silhouetted in the gloom, carrying long poles and buckets. This isn't a late-night delivery. This is the sanitation department, and their shift is just beginning. You've just met the night soil men, or, to use their older, more poetic title, the gong farmers. Their job is simple, essential, and so unbelievably foul that it was literally illegal to perform it during daylight hours. This is a mainstream historical fact. Municipalities across Europe had strict laws forcing these men to work only at night, typically between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m., to spare the general public from the olfactory apocalypse that was their job. They were legally mandated to be disgusting only after sunset. They were sewage-based vampires, and their business was your business. Their task is to empty the city's cesspits. These are the brick-lined pits in the basements or backyards of buildings that collected household waste from privies, indoor toilets. When the pit was complete, a moment you can imagine was announced with some urgency. A family had to hire these guys. You watch as the team stops outside a townhouse. One man, the whole man, takes a deep breath and is lowered by rope into the cesspit, which could be anywhere from 6 to 20 feet deep. His only light is a single, flickering lantern. He's not just cleaning a toilet, he's excavating a biohazard. Down in the suffocating darkness, surrounded by years of concentrated human filth, he shovels the sludge into buckets, which are then hauled up by his partner, the tub man. The tub man then carries the brimming, sloshing buckets to the cart. The smell is indescribable. It's a dense, gag-inducing cloud of fermented regret that clings to the back of your throat and tries to set up a colony. Now, you'd think this would be the lowest-paying, most miserable job imaginable. It was undoubtedly the most pathetic. But here's a quirky tidbit. It could actually be surprisingly lucrative. The night soil they were collecting wasn't just waste. It was a valuable commodity. This raw sewage was sold to farmers outside the city, who used it as a potent fertilizer for their fields. The French even had a fancy name for the processed, dried version, poudre. So these men weren't just haulers. They were middlemen in the surprisingly profitable poop-to-produce pipeline. A skilled and hardworking team of night soil men could earn significantly more than an unskilled laborer. They were literally turning crap into cash. Some even found valuables, coins, rings, spoons, that had been accidentally dropped down the privy, a disgusting but occasionally profitable bonus. It was the world's worst unboxing video, every single night. Despite the decent pay, their social status was absolute zero. They were the original untouchables. The stench of their trade clung to them, their clothes, their homes, and their families. People would cross the street to avoid them. They were barred from many pubs and churches. They lived on the outskirts of town, in their own little stinky, ostracized communities. And this is where historians still argue whether the night soil men were viewed as pitiable outcasts, despised but necessary evils, or a kind of respected, closed guild of specialists who took pride in their foul but essential work. Were they pariahs? Or were they the unsung, stinking heroes of urban sanitation? It's a fascinating academic debate, but you suspect that if you ask the actual Gong farmer, knee-deep in a Georgian gentleman's sins, he wouldn't give a single, solitary crap about the scholarly distinction. He'd want to finish the job, get paid, and find some gin strong enough to make him forget what his hands have touched. The cart is full now, a rolling testament to the digestive fortitude of the London elite. The men cover their toxic cargo with a tarp, but it's a token gesture. The smell follows them down the street like a loyal, invisible demon. You watch them go, these nocturnal guardians of public health, these sewage spelunkers, and you are filled with a profound and sudden gratitude for the invention of modern plumbing. You thought your job was bad, but at least your work doesn't actively try to give you typhoid. The Gong farmers have vanished into the pre-dawn gloom, leaving the city's air supply only marginally less offensive. You follow the lingering stench downhill because gravity is the 18th century's most reliable city planner, and you find yourself on the banks of the River Thames. It's low tide. The river has pulled back its grubby sheets to reveal its secrets, and you wish it hadn't. The Thames is less a river and more a 215-mile-long colonic irrigation system for the City of London. Everything that doesn't get thrown out of a window or shoveled out of a cesspit ends up here. Industrial runoff from the tanneries, waste from the slaughterhouses, the occasional murder victim, and the general, soupy overflow of a million people's lives. The exposed riverbed isn't sand or gravel. It's a vast, stinking expanse of black, greasy mud that shimmers with a rainbow of chemical slicks. And crawling all over it, bent double like penitent sinners, are people. They are primarily children, older women, and men too sick or disabled for any other labor. These are the mudlarks. And congratulations, this is your new career. Your job application was so poor that I had to say no, and your uniform is rags from a century ago. You take a hesitant step onto the riverbank, and the mud makes a sound like a demon slurping soup as it tries to pull your shoe off. The smell is complex. It's the familiar aroma of sewage, but with added notes of rotting fish, coal tar, and a deep, ancient dampness that feels like it could give your very soul a mildew infection. Your job is to sift through this toxic pudding with your bare hands and look for anything, absolutely anything, of value. It's like panning for gold, if gold were tetanus and disappointment. This is a mainstream historical fact. Mudlarking was an honest and desperate occupation for the poorest of the urban poor. Every low tide, they would descend on the riverbanks to scavenge for anything they could sell. Their primary targets were practical items: lumps of coal that had fallen from barges, old rope, scrap iron, and copper nails from the shipyards. Finding a few pounds of coal could mean the difference between freezing to death and just being miserably cold. It was the city's most disgusting and dangerous recycling program. You watch a small boy, no older than 7, his face smudged with grime, let out a cry of triumph. He holds up a corroded copper bolt. He'll get maybe a halfpenny for it from the scrap dealer, enough to buy a stale bread roll. You start your own search, your fingers sinking into the cold, slimy ooze. Every smooth, hard object makes your heart leap for a second. Is it a coin? A lost ring? No, it's a rock. Or a piece of a gin bottle. Or a tooth. You decide not to think about where the tooth came from. The work is backbreaking, and the rewards are pitiful. And it's hazardous. The mud is littered with broken glass, rusty metal, and sharp animal bones. Every cut is a potential death sentence in an age before antibiotics. You are one shard of pottery away from a raging infection that will turn your arm into an angry purple balloon before you die in a feverish haze. As you sift through the filth, your fingers close around something small, flat, and metallic. A coin. You pull it out, your heart pounding. But it's not just a coin. It's been smoothed down on one side and crudely engraved with a picture of 2 linked hearts and the initials TB. You've just found a convict love token, a truly quirky and heartbreaking tidbit from this era, before being transported to Australia, often for life, for crimes as petty as stealing a loaf of bread. convicts would take a common copper coin and engrave it with a message or symbol for the loved one they were leaving behind forever. It was a final, illegal, and profoundly personal goodbye, a tiny piece of graffiti on the currency of the empire that was shipping them to the other side of the world. And it ended up here, in the mud, a forgotten testament to a broken heart, now worth about a penny to the right collector. This whole enterprise feels less like a job and more like a punishment. And that's where the academics come in. Historians still argue whether mudlarking was a recognized, if lowly, profession that served a role in the urban economy, or simply the last resort of the destitute, a form of scavenging that wasn't really a job at all. Was the mudlark a grimy entrepreneur, a tiny cog in the great machine of the city? Or were they just a starving person picking through the trash, with no more professional status than a stray dog? The debate feels wildly out of touch when you're standing knee-deep in industrial sludge. You can be sure the 7-year-old with the copper bolt doesn't care about his classification in the historical record. He wants to eat. The tide is beginning to turn. The water laps at the edges of the mudflats, slowly reclaiming the filth. The other mudlarks gather their meager findings in sacks and begin to trudge back towards the city. You look at your haul. A few bits of coal, a piece of lead pipe, and one heartbreakingly sad penny. It's barely enough to justify the risk, the cold, and the smell that is now permanently bonded to your DNA. As you walk away, the river silently covers its tracks, ready to offer up a new batch of treasures and diseases tomorrow. You've had enough of the toxic waterfront. You climb back up into the maze of city streets, hoping to find a job that doesn't require you to get a tetanus shot just by looking at it. You hear a commotion coming from a narrow, garbage-choked alleyway. It's a cacophony of high-pitched squealing, frantic barking, and a man's voice yelling what sounds like extremely creative curses. You peek around the corner and see him. He's a wiry, hard-faced man in patched leather breeches, and he's not alone. He's surrounded by a swirling, squeaking carpet of rats. And this, believe it or not, is his office. You've just met the royal rat catcher. His official title might sound grand, but the reality is anything but. It's a mainstream historical fact that most major European cities employed official rat catchers to try and control the vermin populations that were, to put it mildly, out of control. The 18th century city was a paradise for rats, with open sewers, overflowing garbage heaps, and granaries bursting with food. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet that never closed. The rats were bold and numerous, carrying diseases like the plague, which people of this era still remembered with a deep, primal terror. The rat catcher was the city's frontline soldier in a war it was definitely losing. You watch him work, and it's a brutal, chaotic ballet. He doesn't have fancy modern traps or poisons. His primary tools are a small, vicious-looking terrier that is currently having the time of its life, a ferret he keeps in a pouch at his belt, and a big stick. He releases the ferret into a rat hole in the wall. A moment later, a terrified torrent of rats explodes out of another opening. The terrier, a furry little whirlwind of death, leaps into the fray, snapping necks with terrifying efficiency. The man himself wades in, his stick a blur as he clubs the remaining rodents with grim satisfaction. It's a scene of organized, verminous carnage. His payment structure is as grim as his job. The tail often pays him. To prove he's done his career, he has to present the rat tails to the city officials. This led to a rather quirky and disgusting form of fraud. Some less than scrupulous rat catchers would set up their own secret rat breeding farms. They would capture a few rats, raise them in a basement, and then harvest the tails from their own supply without ever having to do the dirty work of hunting in the sewers. They were the original rat race capitalists, cornering the market on the very problem they were being paid to solve. It's a brilliant, if utterly vile, business model. But the job wasn't just about killing. A truly skilled rat catcher was also an entertainer and a showman. Some of the most famous ones, like the legendary Jack Black. No, not that one. Queen Victoria's personal rat catcher, would turn their trade into a public spectacle. They would craft elaborate uniforms and catch rats alive to use them in a popular and gruesome blood sport called rat baiting. This involved putting dozens or even hundreds of rats into a small pit with a terrier and taking bets on how long it would take the dog to kill them all. It was like the Super Bowl, but with more screaming and less sportsmanship. The rat catcher was part exterminator, part P.T. Barnum, and part monster. This dual role is where the scholarly debate comes in. Historians still argue whether the rat catcher was seen primarily as a public servant, a vital, if disgusting, protector of public health, or as a figure of the underworld, a purveyor of brutal entertainment who profited from the very filth the city was trying to eliminate. Was he a hero or a villain? A municipal employee or a shady showman? The truth is, he was probably both. He was a man who walked the line between civic duty and gruesome spectacle, his social standing as ambiguous as the contents of the city's sewers. People needed him to keep the rats at bay, but they didn't want to think too hard about how he did it or what he did with the survivors. The battle in the alley is over. The man is collecting the dead rats, his dog panting happily at his side. He offers you a gap-toothed, triumphant grin, and you see that he has two large, live rats in a cage. He pats the cage. "Big show tonight at the 7 Bells," he says. "Gonna make a fortune off these beauties." He then bites the head off one of the dead rats he's holding, a common practice to prove they were freshly killed and not diseased. You politely decline his offer to join, backing away slowly as he strings the dead rats onto a pole. You came looking for a new job, but a career that requires you to manage a team of homicidal rodents and use a ferret as a middle manager is a little too much, even for you. Your coworkers might be annoying, but at least they don't have the bubonic plague. Probably. You flee the rat-infested alleyway, your ears still ringing with the squeals of the dying. You need a job that's less alive. You follow a particularly pungent smell, a smell that makes the riverbank seem like a field of wildflowers by comparison, to the outskirts of the city. Here, nestled amongst the slaughterhouses and the soap boilers, is a district where the air itself seems to be decomposing. You've found the tanneries, and the smell, oh, the scent is a work of art. It's a rich, gagging bouquet of rotting flesh, animal manure, and caustic chemicals, all fermenting together under the hot sun into a perfume of pure, unadulterated horror. Welcome to your new workplace. You see them in the yards, stripped to the waist, their bodies slick with sweat and things you don't want to identify. These are the tanners, the artisans responsible for turning raw, hairy, rotting animal hides into the smooth, durable leather needed for shoes, belts, saddles, and bookbindings. It's a mainstream historical fact that tanning was one of the most essential and most reviled industries in pre-modern Europe. It was so notoriously foul that tanneries were legally required to be located on the edge of town, usually downwind, to spare the citizens from the apocalyptic stench. The tanners themselves were social pariahs, men whose very presence could curdle milk and cause flowers to wilt in shame. You watch the process and you immediately understand why. A cart arrives, piled high with bloody, fly-blown hides from the butcher. The tanner's first job is to remove the hair. To do this, he soaks the hides in a vat of what looks like chunky, off-white soup. This lime solution loosens hair follicles. After a few days, he pulls the slimy hide out and scrapes off the hair and any remaining bits of flesh and fat with a long, curved knife. It's a disgusting, messy job that covers him in a paste of dissolved hair and putrid gore. It looks like he's trying to shave a huge, very dead, very uncooperative alien. But that's just the appetizer. The main course is the tanning itself. To make the hide soft and prevent it from decaying, it has to be treated with tannins. In the 18th century, the best source of tannins was oak bark, but the most crucial ingredient for preparing the hide for the tannin bath was urine. Lots and lots of urine. The hides were soaked in massive vats of stale pee, a substance tanners called master. The ammonia in the urine broke down the hide's collagen fibers, making it soft and porous. This meant the tanner was not just a leather worker, he was a professional urine collector. Tanneries would place barrels outside their workshops for people to contribute to the cause. Others would pay piss pots, collectors who went door to door buying the contents of people's chamber pots. It was a whole economy based on human waste. This job didn't just stink. It took the piss. This is where you find a truly quirky and disgusting tidbit. The best kind of urine for tanning was supposedly from people who had been drinking a lot of beer. The tanners believed the alcohol content gave it an extra kick. But the absolute 5-star Michelin grade stuff. Dog poop. Specifically the white, dried-out poop of dogs. This was known as pure, and it was collected from the streets by some of the city's most destitute people. More on them later. The tanners would make a warm, soupy mixture of water and dog dung called a bait, and soak the hides in it. The enzymes in the poop were incredibly effective at cleaning and softening the leather, giving it a delicate, smooth finish. So, the next time you see a fancy, antique leather-bound book from the 18th century, remember, it was probably marinated in a warm bath of stale beer piss and dog crap. You're welcome. The tanners themselves were a strange and insular community. They were essential to the economy, yet despised by everyone. Historians still argue whether tanners formed their own proud, independent subculture with a strong sense of identity and tradition, or were a trapped, resentful underclass unable to escape the stigma of their profession. Did they take pride in their complex and highly skilled craft, seeing themselves as masters of a foul but necessary art? Or did they live in a state of perpetual, stinking misery, ostracized and bitter? Given that their job involved wading knee-deep in a cocktail of animal brains, manure, and urine, you suspect the answer leans heavily towards the latter. You can't imagine anyone coming home from a long day of baiting hides and thinking, you know, I really love my job. One of the tanners, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, catches you staring. He grunts and hefts a dripping, stinking hide over his shoulder. The smell hits you with the force of a physical blow, and you have to fight the urge to vomit into the nearest vat of urine, which would probably improve its quality. You decide that, on the whole, you'd rather go back to hunting rats. At least the rats didn't require you to start your day by asking your neighbors for their pee. You stumble away from the tannery, your nostrils permanently scarred and your faith in humanity running on fumes. The smell of chemical-soaked decay is fused to your clothes, and you're pretty sure you'll be tasting stale urine for the rest of your life. You need a new career, and you need it now. As you're trying to walk the stench off, you see a crowd gathered in a side street. A dray horse, one of the thousands of equine engines that power the city, has collapsed in its harness, its great body still and its eyes glassy. Its owner, a burly man with a face like a crumpled map, is openly weeping. This wasn't just an animal. It was his truck, his tractor, and his entire livelihood, and it just died in the middle of the street. It's a traffic jam, a biohazard, and a personal tragedy all rolled into one. While onlookers mutter and stare, a new figure arrives, pushing a heavy, two-wheeled cart. He's a grim-faced man with forearms like knotted ropes and an aura of profound indifference. He doesn't offer condolences. He doesn't shoo the crowd. He sizes up the dead horse with the cool, appraising eye of a mechanic looking at a totaled car. This is the knacker. When your four-legged Ford F-150 gives up the ghost, he's the guy you call. He is the city's official dead horse removal service, and his business card probably says, "I'll handle it." Getting a 1-ton animal off a public street is no small feat with a system of ropes and levers, and perhaps the grudging help of a few bystanders. Promised a pint of gin, the knacker hoists the massive carcass onto his cart. The sound it makes is a series of dull, wet thuds that will haunt your dreams. He then trundles off towards his place of business, the knacker's yard. And if you thought the tannery was bad, you have underestimated the 18th century's capacity for industrial horror. The knacker's yard is a post-apocalyptic wasteland on the furthest, most polluted edge of town. It's a field of bones, a mountain of hides, and a swamp of unidentifiable fluids, all buzzing under a thick, black cloud of flies. The air is heavy with the sickly sweet smell of rot, the sharp tang of blood, and the deep, greasy odor of rendering fat. Here, the knacker performs his grim but essential magic. This is a mainstream historical fact. The knacker was the ultimate recycler in a world that couldn't afford to waste anything. He was the end of the line, but also the beginning of a dozen new supply chains. He would expertly disassemble the horse with an efficiency that is both impressive and deeply disturbing. The hide was sold to your friend's back at the tannery. The bones were boiled down to make glue and fertilizer. The hooves were turned into gelatin and household neat S-foot oil. The fat was rendered into tallow for cheap candles and soap. Even the hair from the mane and tail was sold to upholsterers and wig makers. He was the guy who turned My Little Pony into the glue that holds your chair together and the candle that lights your room. But what about the meat? Horse meat was a massive taboo for human consumption in England. But animals had to eat. This is where a quirky and bizarre side hustle comes in. The cat's meat man. These were street vendors who would buy the cheapest cuts of horse meat from the knacker, boil them, and sell them on skewers for a halfpenny a pop as pet food. They'd walk the streets with their trays of rank, steaming meat, crying "cat's meat," and housewives would buy a skewer for their beloved tittles. It was the world's first and most disgusting pet food delivery service. Of course, in a city where thousands were starving, a vast supply of cheap, taboo meat was a temptation few could resist. And this is where historians still argue about the invisible line between the knacker's yard and the dinner table. How much of that unfit horse meat, intended for cats and dogs, secretly found its way into the cheap meat pies and sausages sold in the city's poorest slums? Was the knacker a straightforward recycler of industrial materials, or was he a key figure in a vast, unregulated black market for tainted food? Some scholars believe the trade was minimal, a desperate measure for only the most destitute. Others argue it was rampant, an open secret that the authorities either couldn't or wouldn't stop. It's an academic debate about the secret ingredients of a 250-year-old street food sausage. And either way, the answer is you don't want to know. The knacker finishes his day's work, covered in a sheen of blood, grease, and God knows what else. He is a walking, breathing biohazard, a man who makes a living from death and decay. Like the tanner and the gong farmer, he is utterly essential and universally shunned. You look at the candle flickering in a nearby window and realize it was probably made from the same horse you just saw in the street. The entire glittering, enlightened city is built on a foundation of recycled death, held together by glue made from boiled bones. And you decide, with every fiber of your being, that this is not the career for you. 0 stars. Would not recommend. You've officially sworn off any job involving dead animals. Your new career goal is something clean, something respectable, something indoors. As you're pondering your limited options, a sharp, throbbing pain shoots through your jaw. A toothache. A nasty, soul-crushing toothache that makes you want to punch a powdered wig. You need a doctor, or a dentist, or someone with pliers and a strong stomach. You see a sign down the street that looks promising. A red and white striped pole spinning gently in the breeze. Ah, a barber shop. Place for a nice, clean shave. And as you're about to discover so much more, you push open the door and step inside. The shop smells of cheap, lye-based soap, fragrant hair tonics. And is that copper? No, it's not copper. It's the unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. The floor is covered in sawdust, a detail you initially find charmingly rustic until you realize its primary function is to soak up bodily fluids. On a shelf next to the shaving mugs and razors are tools that do not belong in a hair salon. Bone saws, terrifying metal hooks, and several large jars of writhing leeches, the official interns of 18th century medicine. In the center of the room is a single, sturdy chair with leather straps on the armrests. You've just walked into the office of a barber surgeon, your one-stop shop for a haircut and an amputation. For centuries, these two professions were inextricably linked. This is a mainstream historical fact. The barber surgeon was the go-to medical practitioner for the ordinary person. While university-trained physicians were off diagnosing rich people's gout by examining their urine, the barber surgeon was in the trenches, performing the messy, hands-on work. They were the masters of the blade, whether it was shaving a beard, lancing a boil, or sawing off a limb. That iconic red and white pole? It's a gruesome advertisement, symbolizing the blood, red, and bandages, white, of their trade. You're not at Supercuts. You're at the original urgent care clinic, and their only anesthetic is a stiff drink and a prayer. There's already a patient in the chair. He's a burly sailor with a leg that is not a healthy color. It is, in fact, a vibrant and alarming shade of blackish green, and it smells like something died and then got very, very angry about it. Gangrene, the barber surgeon, a stout man with a disturbingly cheerful demeanor and a leather apron that has seen better decades. is tying a tourniquet around the man's thigh. An assistant hands the sailor a leather strap to bite down on and a bottle of gin, which he chugs with the desperation of a man who knows what's coming next. The barber surgeon turns to his wall of tools and selects a saw. Not a delicate surgical instrument. A saw, like from a toolbox. Right then, he chirps. Let's have this nasty thing off you. And then he begins. The sound is something you will never forget. It's a wet, grating noise, the sound of metal on bone, punctuated by the sailor's muffled, agonizing screams into the leather strap. And this is where a truly wild, quirky tidbit about 18th century surgery comes in. The most critical quality for a surgeon was not precision or cleanliness. It was speed. With no anesthesia, the only mercy you could offer a patient was to get it over with as inhumanely as possible. Great surgeons were legends, their amputation time spoken of with the same reverence we use for a quarterback's stats. 2 minutes for a leg, 30 seconds for a finger. It was a terrifying, high-stakes race against shock and blood loss. To stop the bleeding after the limb was removed, the surgeon wouldn't use stitches. He'd take a red-hot iron from the fire, a cautery, and press it against the stump. The hiss and the smell of burning flesh are the final, horrific crescendo in this symphony of pain. This brutal reality fuels a heated scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the formal separation of the Company of Barbers and the Guild of Surgeons, which occurred in England in 1745, was a genuine advancement in medical standards or merely an act of professional snobbery. The university-trained physicians and surgeons looked down on the barbers as uneducated manual laborers. They wanted to elevate surgery into a respected science, free from the low-class stigma of cutting hair. Was this split driven by a genuine desire to improve patient care through specialized knowledge? Or was it an elitist turf war, designed to create a monopoly for a new class of gentlemen surgeons, leaving the ordinary people with even fewer affordable healthcare options? While academics write lengthy papers on guild politics, the sailor in the chair would probably tell you the only distinction that matters is the one between screaming in agony for 2 minutes and screaming in agony for 5. The leg is off. It lands in the sawdust with a sickening thud. The barber surgeon wipes his bloody saw on his apron, seemingly unfazed. The whole ordeal took less time than it takes to make toast. He turns to you, his eyes bright. Right? Who's next? He beams. What can we do for you today? That's a nasty-looking tooth you've got there. I can have that out for you in a jiffy. He holds up a pair of pliers that look like they were designed to pull nails out of a battleship. Suddenly, your toothache feels a lot better. In fact, it's completely gone. A miracle. You stammer your apologies, back out of the shop, and run. Just run. You are sprinting down the street, propelled by a pure, unadulterated wave of nope that has washed away all your other fears. The sounds from the barber surgeon's shop echo in your skull. The metallic tang of blood is still in your mouth, or maybe that's just the taste of your own terror. Your tooth, which had been throbbing with the heat of 1,000 suns, is now mysteriously, blessedly silent. It has apparently seen what the alternative is and decided to behave. But your relief is short-lived. You've run straight into a bustling town square, where a large, noisy crowd is gathered. It's a market day, and the square is a chaotic circus of vendors selling everything from live chickens to dubious-looking meat pies. In the center of the square, a man is standing on a small wooden stage. He's dressed in flamboyant, mismatched clothes, with a necklace of what looks suspiciously like human teeth around his neck. He has a drum, a monkey on a leash, and the booming, confident voice of a man who has never once in his life experienced a moment of self-doubt. This isn't a musician or a traveling preacher. This is a tooth puller or a tooth drawer, and his stage is his office. He is the freelance, rock and roll version of the barber surgeon you just fled, and he has a much better marketing department. A mainstream historical fact is that for most of the 18th century, dentistry wasn't a distinct medical profession. Tooth pulling was a side hustle for blacksmiths, barbers, and these itinerant charlatans who roamed from town to town. They would set up shop at public fairs and markets, turning a painful medical procedure into a form of public entertainment. They were part dentist, part showman, and part con artist, and their entire business model was based on being loud, fast, and getting out of town before their patients developed a life-threatening infection. You watch his act. It's pure vaudeville. He bangs the drum to attract a crowd. The monkey does a little dance. He launches into a spectacular sales pitch, waving a bottle of his patented miracle elixir, which he claims will not only cure toothaches but also baldness, gout, and a general lack of moral fiber. He has a stooge in the crowd, a man who pretends to have a terrible toothache. The tooth puller gives him a swig of the elixir, mimes a quick, painless extraction behind a cloth, and the stooge leaps up, completely cured, and starts telling everyone how wonderful and painless it was. It's a brilliant, shameless piece of theater. Then a real customer steps forward. A young woman, her face swollen and pale with pain, points to a molar. The tooth puller's cheerful demeanor vanishes, replaced by a look of intense, predatory focus. He sits her on a stool on the stage, in full view of the gawking crowd. He doesn't offer her gin. He doesn't provide her with a leather strap. His only form of anesthesia is distraction. He has his assistant bang the drum as loudly as possible to drown out the screams, while he pulls out his main instrument. It's called a dental pelican or a key, and it looks less like a medical tool and more like a medieval torture device. It's a metal lever with a claw on the end, designed to hook under the tooth and rip it out by brute force. This is where you learn a truly horrifying, quirky tidbit about 18th century dental care. The most significant danger wasn't the pain. It was the jaw-breaking force of these primitive instruments. The tooth puller would brace his knee against the patient's chest, hook the tooth, and pull. There was no finesse. It was pure, leveraged violence. It was incredibly common for the operator to break the patient's jaw, shatter the surrounding teeth, or leave a chunk of the infected root behind, leading to a much worse abscess. The patient was paying a high price for the risk of having their face permanently rearranged by a man with the medical training of a circus animal. The woman on stage closes her eyes and prays. The drum roll begins. The tooth puller goes to work. You can't bear to watch, but you also can't look away. It's a grotesque spectacle, and the crowd is loving it. And this brings up a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the public nature of these extractions served as a form of community support. In this shared experience, the crowd offered a kind of psychological comfort to the sufferer, or was it just a form of sadistic medical voyeurism? Was the crowd there to cheer on the patient, to offer a collective "you can do it" in the face of shared human misery? Or were they just there for the blood and screams, the same way they turn up for a public execution? It's a debate about the very nature of empathy and entertainment in the 18th century. But looking at the gleeful, morbidly curious faces in the crowd, you have a pretty good guess which side you're on. There's a sickening crunch, a muffled scream, and the tooth puller holds up a bloody molar like a trophy. The crowd cheers. The woman, weeping and bleeding, stumbles off the stage, a few pennies poorer and probably a future customer for a barber surgeon who specializes in setting broken jaws. The tooth puller, meanwhile, is already looking for his next victim, his smile wide and his necklace of teeth rattling. He has a whole day of public-facing pain to get through. You clutch your own jaw, your phantom toothache now a dull, empathetic throb. You've decided that a career in medicine is definitely off the table. All of it, forever. You back away from the dental horror show, a new life goal forming in your mind. Find a job with zero human interaction. No customers, no patients, no screaming. You want peace, quiet, and a sturdy lock on the door. You wander away from the noisy, chaotic heart of the city and find yourself drawn to a place on the outskirts that is, by contrast, an oasis of tranquility. It's a churchyard, a cemetery. High stone walls block out the city's roar, and the only sounds are the rustling of yew trees and the lonely cawing of a crow. Perfect. Maybe you could be a gardener here, a groundskeeper. Then you see him. In the far corner of the cemetery, a man is working, his movements slow and rhythmic. He's broad-shouldered and stooped, dressed in drab, earth-stained clothes. He's methodically shoveling soil out of a rectangular hole in the ground. You found the church sexton, but more specifically, the grave digger. And you realize you haven't found a job with no human interaction. You found a job with exclusively deceased human interaction. Your neighbors are terrible conversationalists, but at least they don't complain about the noise. Being a grave digger in the 18th century was a strange and paradoxical profession. It was a mainstream historical fact that the sexton was an official of the church, a position that should have conferred a degree of respectability. He was responsible for maintaining the church and its grounds, ringing the bells, and, of course, interring the dead. He was an essential part of the community's spiritual life, the man who literally laid them to rest. But the daily reality of his job, the constant physical proximity to death and decay, made him a figure of awe, fear, and social isolation. People needed him, but they didn't want to stand too close to him, just in case death was contagious. You watch him work. The hole is about 6 feet deep now. The soil he's pulling out is dark, rich, and lumpy. It's filled with fragments of old wood from rotted coffins, and you realize with a cold lurch, small, discolored pieces of bone. This is because he's not digging in virgin soil. The 18th century churchyard, especially in a crowded city, was not a place of peaceful, eternal rest. It was a finite and constantly recycled piece of real estate. With high mortality rates and limited space, cemeteries were horrifically overcrowded. A grave was less a permanent home and more a short-term lease. After a few years, when the flesh was presumed to be gone, the plot would be reused. The digger would excavate the same spot, unceremoniously turfing out the remains of the previous occupant to make room for the new one. It was a grim but necessary form of subterranean timesharing. This constant soil churning led to a particularly quirky and gruesome problem: the miasma. People of this era believed that diseases were spread by bad air or miasmas, noxious vapors rising from decaying organic matter, and a packed, overflowing churchyard was seen as a miasma factory, a chemical weapon of slow-acting pestilence aimed at the surrounding neighborhood. There are countless contemporary accounts of the foul stenches emanating from graveyards, especially in the summer heat. This led to a particular architectural tidbit. Houses built next to a churchyard would often have their windows on that side bricked up. It was a desperate, and probably useless, attempt to keep the smell of their decomposing ancestors out of the living room. The grave digger pauses in his work, leaning on his spade. He seems to be talking to himself, but then you see it. A human skull, perched on the edge of the grave. He's addressing it Hamlet-style, though his monologue is probably less about the fleeting nature of life and more about the ache in his lower back. This constant exposure to the raw, unfiltered reality of death shaped the grave digger's worldview. And this is where historians still argue whether grave diggers were hardened, cynical figures, rendered callous by their daily work, or deeply philosophical, even spiritual, individuals with a unique perspective on life and mortality. Were they ghoulish and unfeeling, seeing bodies as just another day at the office? Or did their proximity to the end of life give them a profound, if dark, wisdom that the rest of society lacked? Shakespeare gave us the witty, philosophical grave digger in Hamlet. Still, the reality was likely a grim mix of both. A man who had to be callous to survive the job, yet couldn't escape its fundamental existential questions. The funeral procession is arriving. A small, sad-looking group of mourners follows a simple wooden coffin carried by 2 men. The grave digger straightens up, his brief conversation with the skull concluded. He puts on a somber face, the mask of his profession. He helps lower the coffin, mutters a few rote words with the priest, and then, as soon as the mourners have departed, he begins the relentless, final task of filling the hole. It's just another day, another body. The pay is meager, the company is terrible, and your work is literally to bury people's hopes and dreams. You decide the piece isn't worth the bone fragments. Your search for a tolerable career continues. You've decided that working with the dead is just as bad as working with the living, only quieter and with more existential dread. You slip out of the churchyard as the grave digger finishes his work, the final thuds of earth on the coffin echoing in the still air. You need a drink. You find a nearby tavern, a dark, smoky establishment called The Fortune of War, and order a gin. The place is crowded with a rough-looking bunch, but you notice 2 men in a corner, speaking in low, conspiratorial whispers. They are well-dressed, but their hands are covered in dirt, and their boots are caked in a specific kind of clay you just saw in the cemetery. They're looking at you, and their eyes have a shrewd, calculating glint. One of them slides over. "Looking for work, friend?" he asks, his voice a low rasp. "Good pay for a night's work. All you need is a strong back and a weak conscience. A resurrectionist has just offered you a job, a body snatcher. And the quiet, respectable job of burying the dead is about to get a whole lot more complicated. You thought the gravedigger's job was taboo? This one isn't just taboo. It's highly illegal, universally despised, and carries the very real risk of being torn apart by an angry mob if you get caught. The 18th century was a golden age for medical science, particularly the study of anatomy. Universities and private anatomy schools were popping up all over the place, and they all had one massive supply chain problem. They needed human bodies to dissect. Legally, the only bodies they were allowed to use were those of executed criminals. This is a mainstream historical fact. The problem was that there weren't enough hangings to go around to meet the booming demand from all the aspiring doctors and surgeons. This created a desperate, high-stakes black market for corpses, and the resurrectionists were the ghoulish entrepreneurs who filled the void. The man explains the job. It's simple. You wait until a few hours after a fresh burial, under the cover of darkness. You go to the cemetery, not with a big, noisy cart, but with quiet, professional efficiency. You don't dig up the whole coffin. That takes too long and makes too much noise. This is a wonderfully quirky and deeply morbid professional tidbit. A skilled body snatcher would dig a single, narrow shaft down to the head of the coffin. They would then use a crowbar to pry open the lid just enough to get a rope around the deceased's neck or under their arms. Then, using the remaining soil's weight as a fulcrum, they would simply pull. The corpse would slide out of its coffin and up the tunnel, a gruesome reverse birth into the world of medical science. The whole process could take less than an hour. Then you'd pop the dear departed into a sack, smooth over the grave as best you can, and deliver your goods to the back door of the anatomy school for a handsome cash payment. It was a ghoulish, but in their eyes, necessary trade. The pay was fantastic. A single fresh corpse could fetch enough money to live on for months. But the risks were enormous. If the watchman caught you, it meant prison. If the family of the deceased caught you, it meant a savage beating or worse. Public outrage against the sack-em-up men was so intense that people started to take extreme measures to protect their dead. Wealthy families would bury their loved ones in iron coffins or surround the grave with a locked iron cage called a mortsafes. Poorer families would take turns sitting guard over the grave with guns and shovels for weeks after a burial, until the body was decomposed enough to be of no use to the anatomists. The entire country was locked in a cold war between medical science and the sanctity of the grave. This is where you get one of the most contentious and grim scholarly debates. Historians still argue whether the resurrectionists were monstrous ghouls profiting from human grief, or if they were unsung, morally ambiguous heroes of medical progress. Were they criminals, pure and simple, who desecrated the dead for a quick buck? Or were they providing an essential, if illegal, service that allowed surgeons to learn their craft and save the lives of the living? Every single medical advancement of the era, from a better understanding of the circulatory system to new surgical techniques, was built on the backs of these stolen corpses. Do the ends justify the means? It's a debate that pits the emotional and religious need for a peaceful final rest against the rational scientific need for knowledge. The anatomist in his lab saw a specimen. The family saw their beloved grandmother. The resurrectionist saw a payday. You look at the two men. Their offer hangs in the air, smelling of gin and graveyard dirt. You could make more in one night than you would in a year of sifting through river mud. All you have to do is violate one of society's most sacred taboos. You think about the grave digger, so close to the dead every day, yet respecting the finality of their rest. These men, they see the grave not as an ending, but as an opportunity. It's a subtle distinction, but it feels like the difference between working in a hospital and robbing one. You finish your gin, shake your head, and slide off the stool. Some jobs are just not worth the price, especially when the cost is your soul and the product is someone's recently deceased Aunt Mildred. You leave the resurrectionists to their ghoulish business planning and stumble back out into the night. Your moral compass is spinning like a broken washing machine. You've seen disgusting jobs, dangerous jobs, and existentially horrifying jobs. You wonder if there's any profession left that could be more taboo. And that's when you see the poster, nailed to a post and illuminated by a flickering gas lamp. It's an official notice, announcing a public execution to be held at Tyburn tomorrow at noon. And at the bottom, in small, neat print, is the name of the official who will be presiding, the public executioner. You've just found the most reviled, most feared, and most essential job in the entire criminal justice system. The next day, you find yourself drawn, along with half the population of London, to the execution ground. It's not a somber, solemn affair. It's a massive, chaotic public festival. There are vendors selling gin and meat pies, balladmongers hawking gruesome songs about the condemned man's crimes, and wealthy spectators who have rented seats in special viewing stands. Like it's a Taylor Swift concert, but with more hanging. It's a mainstream historical fact that executions in the 18th century were a vast and popular form of public entertainment, meant to serve as a moral lesson and a terrifying deterrent. They were a combination of Super Bowl, church service, and slasher film. And in the middle of it all, standing on the scaffold next to the gallows, is the executioner. He's not a hulking, masked monster. He's a surprisingly normal-looking man, dressed in a sober but well-made suit. He moves with a quiet, professional competence, checking the ropes, speaking briefly to the sheriff, and ignoring the roar of the crowd. He is the star of the show, but he is also the most hated man in England. His job was to be the literal hand of the law, the final instrument of the state's ultimate power. But in a deeply religious and superstitious society, the act of taking a human life, even a legally sanctioned one, placed him in a category all his own. He was a man apart, tainted by death in a way that even the gravedigger was not. You watch him as he goes about his work. When the condemned man arrives in a cart, the executioner helps him onto the scaffold. He is not cruel. In fact, he's often described as being surprisingly gentle. He adjusts the noose around the man's neck, a process that requires considerable skill. This is a quirky and grim tidbit about the art of hanging. A good executioner knew how to place the knot just so, ensuring that the drop would snap the neck and cause instant death. A botched hanging, where the victim would slowly strangle for minutes, was a professional disgrace and could easily incite a riot. The crowd wanted a good dying, and the executioner's reputation depended on his ability to provide a clean, quick, and efficient kill. After the condemned man says his final words, the executioner pulls a hood over his head and, with a final nod from the sheriff, kicks the bolt that releases the trapdoor. The crowd gasps, then falls silent for a moment as the body swings. Then chaos erupts. The executioner's work isn't done. After the legally prescribed hanging time, he must cut the body down. And here, his job takes another bizarre turn. The executioner had a traditional right to the clothes and possessions of the condemned. But his most valuable and gruesome perk was the rope itself. The hanging rope was believed to possess magical or curative properties. People would surge forward, offering him money for a small piece of the rope, which they believed could cure everything from headaches to infertility. The executioner was part civil servant, part butcher, and part dealer in grisly magical relics. This strange mixture of official duty and public loathing is the source of a significant scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the executioner was seen as an agent of divine justice, a necessary instrument in a moral and religious ritual, or simply as a despised pariah, a sin-eater who took on the community's collective guilt for the act of killing. Was he a priest of the gallows performing a sacred, if terrible, public duty? Or was he just the lowest of the low, a man so ostracized that he was often forced to live outside the city walls, barred from regular social contact, his children unable to marry into respectable families? The paradox is maddening. He was a government employee who was treated like a leper, a celebrity whose fame rested entirely on the fact that no one wanted to be him. The body is cut down and placed in a coffin, to be taken, ironically, to the very anatomy schools that the resurrectionists supply. The executioner coils his rope, his face impassive. The state will pay him a fee for his work, and he will supplement it handsomely by selling off his bloody souvenirs. He has performed his duty. He has upheld the law. And now he will go home, back to a life of total social isolation, where his only company is the ghost of the man whose neck he just broke. You look at his steady hands, his calm demeanor, and you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. Some jobs stain the body. This one stains the soul. You wander away from the gallows and into the labyrinthine streets of a poorer neighborhood. Here, the buildings lean closer together, the alleys are narrower, and the smell of coal smoke and gin is so thick you could almost chew it. As dusk falls, the doorways and street corners begin to fill with new figures. Women. They are young, some shockingly so, their faces painted with cheap, crude cosmetics. Their dresses are patched but brightly colored, a desperate attempt at glamour in a world of grime. These are the streetwalkers, the prostitutes, and their workday is just beginning. This is perhaps the oldest taboo job in the world, and in the teeming, chaotic cities of the 18th century, it was a massive, thriving, and brutally dangerous industry. A mainstream historical fact is that for a vast number of poor, working-class women, prostitution was one of the only viable economic options in a world that offered them precious few. If a woman was an orphan, a widow, or had lost her position as a domestic servant, often after being sexually assaulted by her employer and then fired for the moral failing of getting pregnant, the path to the streets was short and swift. With no social safety net and few jobs open to women, selling the only thing she had left to sell was a grim, but rational choice. It wasn't a career path, it was a survival strategy. You watched the grim theater of the street unfold. A woman with a hacking cough and eyes that have seen too much laughs a little too loudly, trying to attract a group of sailors flush with new pay. Another, barely a teenager, shivers in a thin shawl, her gaze darting nervously up and down the street, watching for the parish constable or a violent bully who might try to claim her earnings. This is customer service with a high risk of syphilis and a performance review delivered with a fist. There are no sick days, no HR department, and your only retirement plan is an early grave in an unmarked plot. As you lurk in the shadows, you see a well-dressed gentleman discreetly purchase a small, leather-bound book from a street vendor. He flips through it under the light of a tavern window, his expression that of a discerning connoisseur. This isn't a book of poetry. You've just witnessed a transaction for a copy of Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies, the 18th century's most notorious and quirky publication. It was an annual directory of London's prostitutes, a veritable Yelp review for the sex trade. Each entry provided a woman's name, address, a detailed description of her physical attributes, and a review of her skills and specialties. The write-ups were a bizarre mix of poetic flattery and blunt consumer advice. Miss L. D. of Frith Street. Her conversation is replete with wit and vivacity. One might read, while another warns that a sure Miss D. is rather too fond of the bottle or that her prices are exorbitant. It's a jaw-droppingly cynical artifact, a pocket guide that turned human beings into a list of purchasable commodities, complete with star ratings and user comments. The existence of this list and the sprawling industry it documents are at the heart of a long-standing scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the world of 18th century prostitution created its own unique female subculture, with codes of conduct, support networks, and a degree of agency, or if these women were simply and utterly victims of a brutal system. Did the successful courtesans who ran their own establishments and hobnobbed with the elite represent a form of female empowerment, a way to gain wealth and influence in a man's world? Or were they just gilded cage canaries, their success entirely dependent on the whims of their powerful male patrons, their less fortunate sisters dying of disease in the gutters below? It's a debate that pits the idea of survival as resistance against the bleak reality of exploitation. Thinking about agency is a nice academic exercise. Still, it probably feels a bit hollow when you're trying to avoid a pimp, a corrupt constable, and a client with the plague, all before midnight. The dangers are everywhere. A sudden shriek from a dark alley tells of a transaction gone wrong. A robbery, or worse, the ever-present threat of venereal disease, the Great Pox, hangs over every encounter. In an age before antibiotics, syphilis was a terrifying, slow-motion death sentence, a disease that would rot you from the inside out, ending in madness and disfigurement. The standard treatment was mercury, a poison that made your hair fall out and your teeth loosen in their sockets before you died anyway. You were choosing between a quick death in an alley or a slow one in a disease-ridden hospital ward. You see the woman with the cough finally secure a customer. He's a beefy, red-faced man who looks her up and down not like a person, but like a horse he's thinking of buying. He tosses a coin to her. She catches it, her expression unreadable. They disappear into a gin-soaked, rat-infested boarding house known as a bawdy house. You are left in the cold, listening to the city's nocturnal heartbeat of commerce and desperation. For these women, this wasn't a taboo. It was a Tuesday. It was just another job in a city that had a million ways to kill you, and this was simply one of the more creative ones. You need a break, a serious one. Your soul has been power-washed with the accumulated grime and misery of the 18th century's worst career paths. You've seen enough death, disease, and filth to fill 1,000 horror movies. You crave something that isn't actively trying to kill you or make you vomit. You want glamour. You want art. You want escapism. And then you see it, a theater. The warm glow of candlelight spills from its doors, and you can hear the faint sound of music and applause. Finally, a job that involves creativity and maybe, just maybe, doesn't smell like a decomposing horse. You pay a few pennies to stand in the pit, the crowded area in front of the stage, and push your way into the auditorium. The glamour you were hoping for is not exactly here. The air is a thick, soupy fog of candle smoke, sweat, cheap perfume, and the overwhelming scent of thousands of oranges, which the audience is both eating and occasionally throwing. The crowd is a raucous, boisterous mob. Up in the expensive boxes, powdered lords and ladies are gossiping and flirting, paying more attention to each other than the stage. Down here in the pit with you, it's a standing room, only scrum of apprentices, soldiers, and shop girls who are heckling, cheering, and drinking with the enthusiasm of sports fans whose team is about to win the championship. This isn't a polite evening at the arts. It's a riot with a plot. Then the star of the show makes his entrance, and the entire chaotic room falls silent. He's a famous actor, a celebrity on the level of a modern movie star. He commands the stage, his voice filling the entire theater, his every gesture captivating the rowdy, orange-throwing mob. For the next 2 hours, he holds them in the palm of his hand. He makes them laugh, he makes them weep, he makes them forget for a little while that they live in a city that smells like a toilet. You're watching a master at work. This, you think, is life. Adored by thousands, showered with applause. What could be taboo about this? And then you learn the truth. This is a mainstream historical fact. Despite their fame, actors in 18th century England occupied a legal and social twilight zone. Under the Vagrancy Acts, actors who were not part of a licensed, royally patented company were legally classified as rogues and vagabonds. They were in the same legal category as beggars, fortune-tellers, and streetwalkers. The star on that stage, the man being worshipped by lords and commoners alike, is technically just one bad gig away from being arrested, whipped, and thrown in a workhouse. His celebrity is a flimsy shield against a legal system that views his entire profession as criminal idleness. He's a walking misdemeanor with a fan club. The play reaches its dramatic climax. The hero is dying. The actor delivers a speech so moving that even the gin-soaked hecklers in the pit are wiping away tears. And then, from the back, someone who is clearly not a fan of the performance hurls a half-eaten meat pie that splatters right on the dying hero's chest. This is a wonderfully quirky and brutal tidbit of theater history. Audience participation was not optional. If the crowd didn't like what they saw, they would throw things. Not just oranges and pies, but vegetables, bottles, and, according to some accounts, even dead cats. The actors had to perform under a constant barrage of critical and sometimes dangerous projectiles. Being a celebrity meant dodging flying produce and animal carcasses while trying to remember your lines. After the show, you manage to sneak backstage. The glamour evaporates instantly. It's a cramped, drafty, and chaotic space that smells of sweat, grease paint, and mildew. The star actor is slumped on a crate, his magnificent costume stained with fake blood and real gravy. He looks exhausted. His fame is real, but his life is one of constant travel, financial instability, and social ambiguity. He might be invited to a nobleman's party one night, but he'd be refused service at a respectable in the next. This bizarre contradiction is a playground for academics. Historians still argue whether the rise of the celebrity actor in the 18th century, with figures like the legendary David Garrick, represented a fundamental shift in society's attitude towards the theater, or merely a fascination with a new form of scandalous but disposable celebrity. Were these actors finally being recognized as legitimate artists who were elevating their craft? Or were they just the reality TV stars of their day, famous for being famous, admired for their charisma, but still not considered respectable people? Academics in tweed jackets love to stroke their chins and ponder this, but it basically boils down to whether society was becoming more enlightened or just better at being hypocritical. The final and most damning taboo comes at the end of an actor's life. Because the church viewed the theater as a den of sin and actors as people who made a living by lying, i.e., pretending to be someone else, they were often denied a Christian burial in consecrated ground. The very same church that would gladly accept a famous actor's donation for a new stained glass window would slam its holy doors shut the moment his coffin came calling. You could be the most famous man in London, but in the eyes of God and the law you were a vagrant, and you would be buried like one, in an unmarked grave on the edge of town, far from the respectable folk you had spent your life entertaining. The applause fades, but the stigma is eternal. You slip out of the theater's back door, leaving the gravy-stained celebrity to his precarious existence. The night is colder now, and a thick, greasy fog is rolling in from the river, muffling the city's sounds and making the gas lamps look like hazy, jaundiced eyes. You are well and truly out of ideas for careers. Every job you've encountered is a unique flavor of nightmare. You're about to give up and accept your fate as a professional mudlark when you hear a strange, scraping sound from above, followed by a thin, wavering voice, singing a sad little song. You look up, and you see him, a small, dark shape, silhouetted against the moonlit, fog-shrouded rooftops. It's a child. A very small, filthy child, perched on the edge of a chimney pot like a tiny, soot-covered gargoyle. You have just found what is arguably the most horrifying and shamefully taboo job of the entire Industrial Revolution, which was getting its steam-powered legs in the late 18th century. You found the chimney sweep, or, to be more accurate, the climbing boy, and your 21st century brain, with its quaint modern notions of child labor laws and not shoving kids up a flue, is about to short-circuit. A master sweep, a gruff-looking man with a permanently soot-blackened face, is standing on the street below, yelling instructions. Get a move on, you lazy git. Scrape it clean. The boy, who can't be more than 6 years old, obediently disappears headfirst into the chimney. The job seems simple. The boy shimmies his way down the narrow, winding brick flue, using his elbows and knees to propel himself, scraping the flammable creosote from the walls with a small brush as he goes. The reality is a claustrophobic, suffocating hell. This is a mainstream historical fact. The use of small children as human chimney brushes became widespread in the 18th century, as chimneys were built with increasingly narrow, twisting flues to improve their draw. Only a very small child could navigate these tight spaces. The ideal age for a climbing boy was between 4 and 7. The master sweeps would acquire these children through various, almost universally grim, means. They were often orphans sold by the parish for a few pounds, or the children of destitute parents who were given no other choice. The master would essentially own the boy, his apprentice, until he grew too big to fit in the chimneys, at which point he would be tossed out onto the street with no skills, a ruined body, and a life expectancy that was already in the red. You listen, and you can hear the faint sounds of the boys scraping and coughing from inside the house's brickwork. He is in total darkness, a space often no more than 9 inches square, choked with soot and sulfurous fumes. Every breath is a mouthful of carcinogens. And this is where a truly awful, quirky tidbit of the trade comes in. To toughen up a new apprentice's knees and elbows for the constant scraping, the master sweep would often hold the boy in front of a fire, hardening his skin. A more humane method was to stand the boy on a pile of saltpeter and brine, a process that was agonizing but marginally less likely to cause third-degree burns. Their childhood was a carefully managed program of pain and abuse, all designed to turn them into more efficient tools. The job was, of course, hazardous. Boys would frequently get stuck in the narrow flues. If the master couldn't pull them out from the bottom, his solution was often to light a fire in the grate below, hoping the smoke and heat would encourage the boy to find a way out. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just suffocated him. They fell from rooftops. They developed horrific skin diseases from the soot that was permanently embedded in their skin. And most insidiously, they developed a specific and deadly illness known as chimney sweeps cancer, a brutal form of squamous cell carcinoma caused by the constant irritation of the soot. It was the first occupationally linked cancer ever discovered, a fatal reward for a childhood spent in darkness. The sheer, undeniable horror of this practice is one of the few things from this era that doesn't provoke much scholarly debate. However, historians still argue about the timeline and the motivations behind the movement to abolish the practice. Was the public outcry against the use of climbing boys, which began in the late 18th century, driven by a new, enlightened sense of humanitarianism and compassion for children? Or was it more of a middle-class PR move, a way for the newly prosperous to distance themselves from the grime and brutality of the industrial world that was making them rich? It's a debate about whether the abolitionist movement was born of pure empathy or of a desire to sweep the uncomfortable evidence of their society's cruelty under a cleaner, more respectable rug. The boy finally emerges from the top of the chimney again, a slight, triumphant silhouette against the sky. He holds up his brush to show the master he's finished. He is covered from head to toe in a thick layer of black soot, his eyes and teeth starkly white in his darkened face. He looks less like a human child and more like a sad little ghost, haunting the rooftops of a city that is slowly, methodically consuming him. You realize you have finally hit rock bottom. There are no more rungs to descend on the ladder of terrible jobs. This is it. This is the one that makes even the grave diggers and the resurrectionists shudder. The little chimney sweep has vanished over the rooftops, leaving you on the street feeling like you've just been punched in the soul. You've reached the absolute nadir of 18th century employment. There can't be anything worse. Can there? You begin walking, aimlessly now, your spirit well and truly broken. Your historical job fair has been an unmitigated disaster. You're ready to go back to the mudlarking pits. At least the toxic sludge didn't have a backstory that could make a stone weep. As you're trudging through a wealthy, fashionable neighborhood, you see a figure stooped over in the gutter. It's an older woman, her back bent, her clothes a collage of rags. She's carrying a wooden bucket and is intently, methodically, scooping something off the cobblestones. You assume she's a street sweeper, another cog in the city's barely functioning sanitation machine. But she's not sweeping up trash or horse manure. You get a little closer, and the specific, pungent aroma hits you. She is collecting dog poop. And this isn't just a grim, private hobby. This is her job. You have just met a pure finder, and you are about to learn that the 18th century economy had a special place for every imaginable kind of filth. This is a mainstream historical fact, though one often left out of polite history books. The pure that the pure finders were collecting was a valuable industrial commodity. As you learned back at the tannery, the white, dry dung of dogs was a crucial ingredient in the process of baiting hides to make fine, soft leather. This leather wasn't for clunky work boots. It was used for the most delicate and expensive products: high-fashion gloves, purses, and the bindings for luxury books. The Pure Finder was the very first and most disgusting link in the luxury goods supply chain. She was harvesting dog waste so that a duchess could have a nice new pair of gloves. You watch her work, and it's a masterclass in desperation. She scans the streets with a practiced eye, spotting her quarry from yards away. She moves with a surprising swiftness, scooping the pure into her bucket with a small wooden paddle before anyone can object to her presence in their posh neighborhood. Her customers were the tanners, who would pay her by the bucketful. It was a meager, hand-to-mouth existence, but it was an existence. She was a freelancer, her own boss in the grimmest, most pathetic gig economy you can imagine. Her entire career was dependent on the digestive health of the local canine population. This job was so low, so utterly bottom of the barrel, that it gives us a truly quirky and poignant linguistic tidbit. The pure finders themselves were often just called pure finders, but the term pure, for the dog dung they collected, is a fantastic piece of 18th century ironic slang. They called this foul substance pure because of its purifying properties in the tanning process. But the name also highlights the bizarre alchemy of their world, where the filthiest refuse of the streets could be transformed into the purest symbols of wealth and status. It's a level of sarcasm so deep it loops back into profundity. The job, of course, carried an incredible social stigma. If the gong farmer was at the bottom of the social ladder, the pure finder was somewhere in the sub-basement, digging a hole. They were seen as the most wretched of the poor, human scavengers who literally lived off the excrement of animals. They were often older women, widows with no family to support them, for whom this was the absolute last resort before the workhouse or starvation. And this is where you find the final, and perhaps saddest, scholarly debate of your journey. Historians still argue whether these hyper-marginalized occupations, such as pure finding or mudlarking, constituted an actual informal economy with its own rules and structures, or were simply random acts of survival on the fringes of society. Was the pure finder an entrepreneur, identifying a market niche and servicing it, however disgustingly? Or was she just a starving older woman picking up poop because it was the only thing left that wasn't nailed down? It's a debate that tries to impose economic theory on raw, unfiltered human desperation. Calling this a job or a profession feels like a cruel joke. It was the complete and utter absence of any other choice. The older woman has filled her bucket. She straightens up, her back cracking audibly, and begins the long, slow shuffle towards the tanneries on the edge of town. She doesn't look at you. She doesn't look at the fine houses or the wealthy people passing by. Her world has shrunk to the cobblestones at her feet and the stinking prize in her bucket. You look at your own clean hands and are overwhelmed by a sense of profound, time-traveling privilege. You've seen it all. The filth, the death, the disease, the exploitation. You have completed the grand tour of everything your ancestors did to survive in a world that was actively hostile to their existence. And you have never, ever been more grateful for your tedious, safe 21st century desk job. And so, as the pure finder disappears into the London fog, your journey is over. You've clocked in for a shift at the world's worst career fair and somehow you've survived. You've met the brave, the desperate, and the downright bizarre people who did the jobs that kept the wheels of a brilliant, hypocritical, and profoundly smelly society turning. You've walked in the shoes of the night soil man, sifted through the grime with the mudlark, and peeked into the terrifying toolkits of the barber surgeon and the tooth puller. You've learned that the beautiful leather gloves on a lady's hands began their life in a bucket of dog poop. You made it. You navigated the open sewers, you dodged the flying feces, and you managed not to get a back alley amputation. The world you're returning to has health codes, and for that you should probably build a small shrine. But the ghosts of these taboo jobs are now with you. The next time you flush a toilet, you might give a silent thank you to the gong farmer. The next time you see a construction worker in a hard hat, you might think of the little climbing boy on the roof. And the next time your boss asks you to do something unpleasant, you can look them dead in the eye and say, well, at least it's not collecting pure. The journey is over. You can breathe through your nose again. You can wash the psychic and literal filth of the 18th century off your hands. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember, your job might be tedious, but at least your key performance indicators aren't measured in dead rats or stolen corpses. Probably. Sweet dreams.